This is Ferguson, Jonathan Ferguson, the Keeper of Firearms and Artillery at the Royal Armouries Museum in the UK, which houses a collection of thousands of iconic weapons from throughout history. And this week he's taking a look at an absolute classic of the genre, the original GoldenEye 007.
Okay, this is looking less like an MP5K than I remember, funnily enough. The curvature of the magazine, all of that looks right, and so your brain overlooks the fact that the receiver and the forend look absolutely nothing like an MP5K. Neither does this. That's a firing port, and that is the trigger, because in here, a D5K, well, an MP5K.
If you like this kind of content, we've got a brand new season of Loadout airing on the channel right now. New episodes are up every Sunday, and you can check out our most recent episode about the weird ways games use calibers within their virtual arenas. Right, let's take a look at the iconic weapons from GoldenEye.
So a real instant hit of nostalgia here, and being as it's the starting weapon and the most iconic James Bond weapon of all time, the PP7. These are all going to be an early example of legally different names. Of course, the graphics don't really lend themselves at this era to super detailed depictions in terms of likenesses. But anyway, the PPK, of course, is what this really is. In the Bond movies, it's often a PPK/S, which is the 380 ACP version that's a little bit bigger. This example I've picked for you today from the collection is, you probably won't be able to see it, but it's a PPK-L. This is a pretty rare variant with a lightweight aluminium or aluminum, if you prefer, frame. So that's the real example. The other thing that stands out for me is that pew pew sound with the suppressor attached. Now, we don't have any PPKs threaded for a suppressor. I don't think that was a common thing to do in reality. So that sound effect, done some research into that. But the very first appearance of that sound effect is an obscure today anyway, film called Blue, White and Perfect from 1942. And the sound engineer for that movie created that classic, almost ray gun sound effect. But it's just tremendous to see this game in action again, and I'm motivated to dig out a version of it and play it again. Okay, we've got a rifle. We've got the KF7 Soviet, which is quite far removed from its real name. Easily recognizable, of course, as the AK, Kalashnikov, whatever you'd like to call it. I think on the basis of the, by modern standards, very crude front sight being a circle. You can see that on this Chinese Type 56, which is what this is. I've chosen a Type 56 to show you. Well, also because in the case of the folding stock version, you can sort of replicate the look of this gun simply by folding the buttstock. This has got a nice original sling on it as well. Like every other weapon in this game, I was blown away at the time in '97 when I saw such a well animated and modeled and textured weapon. Cartridge cases flying out, the 3D, amazing stuff. You know, to me, that was a well depicted, accurate rendition of an AK. The one thing that did raise a little weird flag in my brain for all of the two-handed weapons is the weirdness that, if I remember rightly, in third person you'd see two hands on the gun, but in first person it waves around with one hand, which, needless to say, is not the way to be able to hit anything if you're trying to shoot. Now, this is an interesting one. I think in my head, this was always the WA2000 from The Living Daylights, which we featured before. But actually, of course, it isn't. It is a conventionally laid out sniper rifle. But if you look at the design, it's pretty funky. And I don't know if at one point it was arranged in a bullpup configuration like the WA2000, and they just didn't like the look of it and flipped it around, because the way there's a sort of metal shoe attaching a very chunky wooden butt to a pistol grip forestock, it really does look like an unbullpupped WA2000 to me. Maybe I'm reading into it, but there are certainly in the 90s, there wasn't, I can't think of a sniper rifle that really looks anything like this. This gun also suffers from, of course, from the pew pew sound effect. Now, if you can make a small caliber pistol like a PPK sound more like that. Actually, that sort of sound is actually the sound you hear at the berm or wherever the bullets are passing. If you put a fast-moving bullet past a microphone, you can get a sound that sounds very, very much like the choo-choo sound. You can't really do that with a rifle bullet for reasons. Well, go and watch the loadout episode on suppressors, because we cover that in that episode. Now, this is a fascinating one. Back in 97, I had no idea what this was. It is, in fact, a real gun. Sights or Sighties? I can't remember. Spectre is the real gun that this is actually really closely based upon. And if you're thinking, well, it's not quite the right outline, if we deploy the stock, now obviously there's no stock on the gun, and if we lock that in place and then ignore it, that is, for the graphics of this time, spot on. It even has this shape here, to this stamped steel receiver, distinctive angle. The proportions are all correct. The angle of the magazine. The biggest difference is the color. As far as I know, there is no white metal, in the white unfinished version, or chrome or nickel or anything like that. But if you did nickel or metallic sort of silver color coat the receiver on this gun, it'd be basically spot on, at least for the time. Really unusual gun, really interesting, very cool, very Cold War, and by extension, very Bond. Really interesting gun, really cool in the game as well, I think. I'm looking here at the loosely SPAS 12 inspired auto shotgun. Pretty primitive compared to the models for the other guns in the game. I didn't see a trigger or a trigger guard on there, which the others do have. There's a fair bit of detail, actually, given the limitations of early 3D graphics, whereas this is basically an L shape. Although it does have some nicely modeled cartridges in a side saddle shell holder on the top of the gun, which gives it a nice look. The fore end, and I think probably what makes it look less like a SPAS, is brown. So brown equals wood in this period of graphics. The SPAS never had a wooden fore end. Coming not too many years after Doom and Doom 2, where you just could see your impacts on a wall or on the enemies, and it was the first time for me anyway, you actually felt like you had a spread of shot that was having an effect and doing something sort of visceral. GoldenEye sort of, in a way, doesn't feel as visceral because those impacts are like sparking. You get a sort of sparking effect. But because it had this quite realistic for the time depiction of bloody gunshot wounds, you get both effects. You get the slightly weird sparking, and you get the red mark where the bullet hits, and then a load of quite realistic sort of death animations as well. Very surprising for a Nintendo game at this time, let me tell you. Another weapon I had clean forgotten about, the rotary grenade launcher. It's very MGL, maybe a bit of the old Enfield Arwen in there, perhaps. I can't remember if that was in a Bond movie. It would make sense if it had been. I can't think of a direct gun that this is based directly upon. Fairly ahead of its time by animating the drum rotating, although it seems to rotate a bit quickly. With the real guns, you shoot a grenade, either you release a trigger and it clockwork clicks to the next, or in some way it moves after firing. This seems to move a bit quickly, just something I picked up on watching this again. Slightly curious delay on the effect on the enemies, in that you'll get a glorious explosion and then a bit later they'll fall over. Whereas, of course, with a real explosion, the blast wave, if anything, travels ahead of the fiery bit, the fireball. So it's slightly curious, which led to another weird situation where the explosion goes off, and it obviously has a very tightly defined area of effect, and an enemy walked into that after the fact and then died. Which, again, not something I remember seeing. Loads of variety of the weapons in this game for the time. Tremendous amounts of effort must have gone into this. Right, one of the more memorable guns in the game for me, partly because of the name, I guess, and I know they use developers' names to derive some of these, the Klobb, the VZ Scorpion. I did not remember that the Klobb in the game had the wire stock modelled on the gun. It's kind of curious, given that and some of the other details that are on the guns in the game, that so many of the guns do not have a stock. But anyway, we have this distinctively shaped stock. It's not functional, of course, but it really reinforces that this is in fact the Scorpion. It pretty much behaves in the game, not exactly like it does in real life, obviously, but in terms of how it feels to the player, I'd say it's pretty close. So I'm thinking now about the sound, which I haven't really mentioned so far. For the time, great sound effects. They're clearly not recorded live or anything like that, but in relative terms, they sound weaker than the bigger guns. You know, they haven't just used a stock gunfire sound effect for everything, as would have been done for all bullet firing weapons in most games at this time. The rate of fire is close enough, to be honest with you. This thing has a fairly impressive rate of fire reducer system built into its grip that slows this thing down from what would probably be about 1,200 rounds per minute down to much more controllable levels, 750 or something, if I remember rightly. So not a million miles away from this. So in terms of how it's pitched in the GoldenEye arsenal, it's a really, really good gun. Dual wielding. I've only got one Scorpion out, so I can't dual wield. We do have a loadout episode of me awkwardly trying to dual wield that you should definitely check out if you haven't already. Do you know, I'm not going to set myself up for failure here by attempting this, but I think I probably would have done better at that with a pair of Scorpions, because the recoil of that cartridge is lower than something like the 9mm that we were shooting. The funny thing is, firing automatic, once you start firing, you can adjust and correct and get your weapons on target and hold them there with a weapon like this. So I'm not saying this is practical in any way, but for action movie-esque nonsense, 2 Scorpions at the same time is somewhat plausible. Don't try this at home, kids. Right, the AR-33, which you might think would be a legally different HK-33, but no, this is of course an M16 series weapon, A2 handguards. It's not detailed enough to say what model, but I think we can guess from context and period before anyone really knew what an M16A3 was. This is meant to be an M16A2. Having said that, there are different types of M16A2. M16A2 is both the US military designation for a certain model, or actually a couple of models, technically. The reason I'm burbling about that is that I've brought to show you a British service, American made obviously, but British service M16A2, marked as such, M16A2, because M16A2 was also a brand from Colt. So this is one that was purchased for the British service. It has the A1 rear sight setup. It is automatic, like the M16A3 in American Navy service. And apart from that, what makes it British, and I have a video on this on the Royal Armouries channel if you'd like a deeper dive, featuring this exact gun. Black paint finish, serial number on the upper receiver. They're the main differences. Not significant, but it's our little slice of the Armalite AR-15 history. Here, it's not bad for early 3D graphics. The handguard is looking a bit janky, certainly to modern eyes. The only sort of criticism would be that the stock is dropped. Now, firstly, that's one of the design features of the Armalite. It's meant to be an inline design, so your recoil is all happening along one line, which is great for controlling the weapon. And in technical terms, you have to do that anyway because the recoil buffer, your return spring essentially, is housed in a tube within the stock. So you could not have it down here. There are modern AR variants where the spring is relocated into the receiver. That's effectively what you'd have to have here for this to work. As to why Rare did this, I would guess it's so that in first-person view, the stock isn't clipping through your vision. I'd forgotten that this has the rather wonderful star-shaped muzzle flash that Hollywood was obsessed with already by this point, which shouldn't be possible with an A2, funnily enough, because the A2 has the solid bottom to the birdcage flash suppressor. So you should not get that perfect star shape. You should get a partial star, if that. It's not usually that visible, certainly not in daylight. With Hollywood, they use blanks with an awful lot of powder to precisely to get that exaggerated effect, and this is one of the early-ish representations of that very distinctive flash, which is just very cool. My memory's failing me today. Is this the first game appearance of the FN P90? It's certainly the first time I remember ever seeing a P90 in a game. Even back then, I recognized it pretty much immediately as a P90. This was the latest, coolest gun. It's pretty close in silhouette, as it were. The foregrip is separated from the rear grip, which is, as we know, is not the case on the real gun. That's all one molding. And yeah, the GoldenEye did pretty well. It's got some weird vertical ribbing on the butt that isn't on the real gun. I think I just put that on there for the sake of detail. Might have been better if they wanted to match the P90, if they put maybe just one down the side to replicate the contour of the receiver. I guess the biggest departure here is this looks like a 1960s version of a P90 with stamped sheet metal and wooden, actually yeah, more like 50s really, wooden furniture and a very funky looking magazine where we've talked before about the evolution of the P90 magazine in games and how it's got to the point now where it essentially looks like the real thing. This of course couldn't really look further from the real thing. I don't really know what they're going for with that. Now, seeing this thing back in action again reminds me that, I suspect anyway, in the game, the P90 is not using the same feed system at all. So that section on top of the gun is not meant to be the magazine. It's ventilated heat shield, almost like a SPAS 12, part of the receiver, and it's in a different bright metal finish. But overall, it's still the right sort of configuration. We have the metal straps, effectively, of the sight mount bridge, the actual metal part of the receiver that sits inside this polymer stock. That's represented wrapping around what's the magazine on the real gun. So you still get the sense that you're using a P90. I shouldn't overlook the 80 round capacity of the fictional P90, 50 rounds on the real gun. And of course, the fact that it's spewing out cartridge cases from the right-hand side just reinforces for me that it's not either they just saw a picture of a P90 and went with that, or they consciously chose to showcase their beautiful 3D cartridge cases flying out of the gun. Either way, that's not how P90 works. Okay, this is looking less like an MP5K than I remember, funnily enough. Well, it's got the right proportions, it's got a very well done, perfectly circular front sight protector, with no sight in it, of course. Graphics didn't support it really at that time. And the shape of the foregrip, it's even got the little finger stop at the front, the curvature of the magazine, all of that looks right, and so your brain overlooks the fact that the receiver and the forend look absolutely nothing like an MP5K. Neither does this. But I'm sure some of you already know what this is. That's a firing port, that's a safety catch, and that is the trigger. Because in here, we have a D5K, well, an MP5K. So designed to fire from within inside the briefcase, operational briefcase. And then if you were in a protracted Bond-style firefight, you open it up and out comes your MP5K. As you can see, this does have the finger stop. It has the ribbed shaped foregrip, much simplified of course. The correct curvature for the magazine. So from first person view, we don't worry about the rear sight being missing. We just see the iconic shaped HK front sight. So yeah, in terms of the one-handed thing or the inevitable dual wield, again, action movie plausible. The MP5 is a heavier weapon than the Scorpion, so it might be a bit more fatiguing for your wrists, but the weight will help you keep it on target if for whatever reason you're firing it one-handed. However, the recoil of 9x19, although subjectively reduced in the MP5, still going to be significantly higher than the Scorpion. Not to be recommended. You really need to be holding it with both hands. Push-pull method. It'd be very cool for someone to mod in somehow the operational briefcase and have you fire it in HK fashion from under your chin. Right, the rocket launcher, which appears to be loosely based on the RPG-7, about the only rocket launcher, technically a recoilless weapon with a rocket-assisted munition that I think the developers would have been aware of, or I would have been aware of in 1997. It's close enough to that, I think, for recognition purposes. It has a flared sort of rear end, not as pronounced as the Venturian blast tube on the back of the RPG-7, and it's sort of the way it steps down from narrow at the front to thicker in the middle and even thicker at the end. It doesn't actually fit the RPG that well, but I think from the shape and configuration of the iron sights, the fact it has a pistol grip, I think it's an RPG-7. But it's pretty busy looking. It's got a lot of detail on there that the real thing doesn't have, and it looks to be sort of all metal. Obviously, the RPG has the Bakelite aspects to it. Yeah, I think maybe less attention has been paid to this in terms of what it is. It's more of a generic video game weapon than most of the others. All right, an interesting choice for a Magnum revolver. And although the proportions are pretty squiffy, you can see a lot of the diagnostic features of this, the Ruger Blackhawk, especially in this satin finish. The shape of the front sight and its base, the shape of the frame, especially the, well, it's not uncommon on revolvers, but all the basic facets are there. The hammer has gone a bit awry. But we do have a separately modelled cylinder, which is somewhat impressive. The wooden grips, they're a weird shape on the GoldenEye version. They're much more the ploughshare shape of the traditional single-action army on the original Black Hawk, but they are meant to be wooden grips. The Black Hawk somehow is double action in GoldenEye. I couldn't remember that detail, so it was one I was waiting for. But we do see the hammer animated, which is quite impressive actually, but it is magically being cocked and released by the trigger finger, which is not possible with a single action trigger mechanism, unless it is also a double action trigger mechanism. Something I haven't mentioned so far is the other reloads in GoldenEye. Well, there aren't any. You simply lower the gun off camera, you hear a click, and your gun is reloaded. So it's heavily fudged in the game, which was again sort of a technical thing, I guess, in that 2D animations had got somewhat sophisticated, showing magazines or shotgun shells or whatever being loaded into a weapon and cases flying out. We have cases flying out. We don't have reloads. So click and it's full again. The Moonraker Laser, probably my least favourite gun in the game, although it is somewhat faithful to Bond lore, although I'm not sure Moonraker is anyone's favourite Bond movie. The original prop for the film, as I'm sure some of you have spotted, was an Uzi, full-size IMI Uzi submachine gun, painted white, with some stuff stuck to it. It does a fairly good job of breaking up the outline, which is probably why the GoldenEye version looks about right, proportions-wise, but has no real hint of the Uzi that was underneath the disguise parts in the movie. Golden Gun, of course, that's from the straight out of one of the movies as well. Of course, in its original movie context, it's a sort of disguised weapon made from different parts. I believe the armourers, or the prop master rather, went to a cigarette lighter manufacturer in order to create the thing. Pretty fascinating bit of movie history. In this footage, you can actually see my favourite thing about the guns of GoldenEye, which was the ability to aim your gun anywhere on the screen with one of the thumbsticks. Something that's almost never been done since. Just love that. It's limiting in many ways for modern FPS shooters, FPS players. But at the time, I just loved the ability to move with one stick, and shoot anywhere on the screen instinctively, which felt a lot like something I've never tried in real life, which is point shooting, where this was taught to the commandos, among others. You look where you shoot, and the game effectively simulated doing that. Very critical to be able to do that for me with the Golden gun, because you have that one round before you go to your reload, and so you only get that one critical shot. Thank you for watching, guys. We appreciate it. These were the guns of GoldenEye, one of my all-time favourite video games. If you're in the UK or are sufficiently crazy to come to the UK specifically for this, there is an event going on the 11th of March where if you pay for the ticket, you'll be able to have a bit of a meet and greet with me, and there's all sorts of other stuff going on that weekend around the theme of historic firearms. A new batch of tickets is being released imminently, I believe, or may have been already by the time you see this. In any case, love to see you again next week.